Some of you know me from having been the executive director of the Flowchart Foundation, which celebrates the work of John Ashbery. I am shifting from one John to another. I am the incoming new director of the John Cage Trust, which is located at Bard College, just south of here. And it's nice because they were friends, so it's an easy shift. It's a metronomical shift. Right? Okay. Thank you, literary folks, for that. Smattering for metonymy.
And John Ashbery worked at Bard. So
and John Ashbery taught at Bard, so it all works out.
Just one big
few people have even noticed the change. You just sending other speakers. But I'm here now representing the John Cage Trust. By the way, the founding director of the trust, Laura Kuhn, is right over there.
He's my heir apparent.
I'm the heir apparent. And we, much like the Flowchart Foundation, celebrate the extraordinary life, work, thought, artworks, poems, music of John Cage, as well as how he is still producing today through the work of others, and we're going to find out in just a moment how that's happening in a really beautiful way. Siôn Parkinson, who is here from Edinburgh, is a musician, sculptor, postdoc botany fellow at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, many other things, book author. Hold up the book. This fabulous book, Stinkhorn.
I've taken off the dust jacket because it
yes,
get ripped and transported.
Your own deluxe copy would have a beautiful dust jacket. And it's around this book that we invited Siôn to do this presentation, which some of you, I think we're seeing again today, saw yesterday at Bard. Pretty fabulous. So you're in for a treat. A sensory journey through the world of the Stinkhorn mushroom. And it's going to take you on a journey that will take you through smell, sound, the senses, brains, all kinds of things. So without further ado, Siôn Parkinson. Oh, I want to say thank you to Eric Longo, who's the interim director here at the Flowchart Foundation, who's very kindly partnered with us to present here at the Flowchart Foundation, my old home. So thank you, Eric. Okay, take it away, Siôn.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Eric. And the citizens of Hudson for being so hospitable. I travelled over from, I live just north of Edinburgh, a little city called Dundee, which was where I was born. And I got the hell out of there as quickly as I could, and I've returned there. And I struggled to get over here, and with the help of Jeffrey and Eric, managed to get me here today. So thank you very much for welcoming me here. And it was my pleasure to speak at Bard yesterday. Thanks for those who came to see that, and apologies if I'm going to repeat anything, but get over it. I'll try to make it a little more interesting. And Eric, thank you for hosting us here today as well. I'm going to talk to you about many things, all through the vein of this mushroom. And I'm going to weave in multiple olfactory objects, so stinking things, right? And how I think it's time that we combine the senses, plural, to have a more total perspective on the ecology of both the human and the more than human, and how they affect one another. We're part of this, we kind of talk about nature with a capital N as something that's separate from us. But Cage knew, we all know, and we hopefully know more of how we fit into what is not strictly a hierarchy of organisms. It's a flattened structure. But for the last 5 years, probably more than that, I've been thinking about this one mushroom in particular. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. And I trained as a sculptor for about 15 years. And my job now, which is amazing, is as a sniffer in residence at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, which is a 350-year-old institution in Edinburgh. Has 3 million specimens of plants and fungi in their herbarium. And for those of you who don't know, a herbarium is where an organisation, as a result of efforts by botanists, mycologists, collect and preserve plant material. So, and they store them often in these types of folders, flattened. These paper sheets, this beautiful collage technique that tells a story of biodiversity and its loss. So it's as well as being a repository, an archive of biodiversity, it's also it tells a story of extinction and black holes, or brown holes, as it were. And it's my job there to try and find the stories that are hidden behind some of these cabinets by choosing to privilege the nose rather than the eyes, which we favoured for so long. But there are things that we're missing. We're missing for a number of reasons, which I'll go on to argue. One, it's partly to do with the way that we prioritise certain senses. It's also to do with the colonial history, especially in the West. But it's also to do with where there are blind spots. And again, that kind of emphasis on sight, partly by a compulsion to name things, often, as I'll come on to, in relation to ourselves and our own physical beings. So this kind of work of going in and sniffing these cabinets, sniffing these mushrooms, finding out how mycologists have chosen to describe the specimens that they've collected and what it reveals about the cultural context or the smellscapes that they once moved through. But my other, well, I'm going to tell you two more things about how I operate as sniffer in residence at the botanics, is also looking at mycological literature, so mushroom books, printed mushroom books, mycological illustrations, which, if you think back to how artists and scientists operate together, it wasn't necessarily mutual. One served the other. There was definitely a hierarchy there. The artist had to subscribe to certain norms of relaying information about the morphology, the shape of mushrooms, in order that they could be categorized properly. So they're functional, and I would argue that they're maybe not even art in an expressive sense, although there is room for that. But does any of you worked in a library before, or as an archivist? There's this great term, right, which is the bane of librarians' life, called grey literature. You heard this term? Grey literature is typically any printed material that was made for no commercial value, right? So pamphlets, it might even be kind of material that's printed by the organisation themselves, but also needs then to be catalogued and stored somewhere. Grey literature. There's a grey literature conference, which has a very depressing website, which I love. What I was interested in is how, over time, these mushroom books begin to print themselves, compressed for 200, 300 years in these libraries. The ink transfers from one page over to the other, and I've been moving around Britain, finding these copies, these particular mushroom books, to see if this phenomenon is happening across all of these different 18 volumes. So these are quite rare books, but what I'm finding is that the same images appear next to each other. There's two things happening here. One is that within these books there are descriptions of odours that are unfamiliar to us now. So for example, when we come onto it, the Stinkhorn mushroom is described in these books as smelling like bricks, of burning bones, of hartshorn manufactories. And I didn't know what a hartshorn manufactory was. Does anyone here know what it is?
Deer antler.
There you go. So it's a deer, it's a deer antler, red deer, that was used, they would grind it down and they would use it as a baking agent. It's also used as an ingredient for smelling salts. So, but I also liked how within these images, we'll come on to this as well, how they're almost like visual depictions of scent. There's another mushroom connection here. For those of you who've been out mushrooming and have used the diagnostic tool called a spore print, where you take the cap of a mushroom, you place it down on some paper, you cover it over with an opaque bowl, leave it overnight, and the mushroom will drop its spores. And when you take it away, it leaves an index of the shape, how it drops its spores, but also you can kind of scrape them, you can find the colour of the spores as well. And I like the idea that this is a book that's printing itself, and it's its own artist. As well as producing these images, which if you were to go into the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is this incredible store of ecological literature, these images will be, the descriptions will come up as them saying that they're blank. They're not blank. They're clearly not blank. We don't have a word for these types of images, or we kind of do loosely. But I think brown literature gets us a bit closer to a style of, a type of image that, well, you get a sense of what I'm talking about here, don't you? But there is something remarkable here. And in the Library of Congress, they talk about, in the digitization efforts, preserving the look and feel of the original. The look and feel, not the smell, because that's something that can't be conveyed digitally. But there is something that where we, again, talk about the feel of something and how that kind of haptic quality can be conveyed. This does get us close as well. The mushroom that I'm going to talk to you about, the Stinkhorn mushroom, I landed upon it for a couple of reasons, but one was I was waiting to go into a recording studio to record some a cappella vocals, and I was looking for something to sing, some words to inspire me to sing. I went through a famous, at least in the UK, book by a writer called Roger Phillips, and in this compendium, this mushroom identification guide, he describes 76 descriptions of scent that are scattered throughout this book. When you land upon the Stinkhorn, it says it smells offensive, right? Which isn't actually a description of smell. That's a description of an experience, or of what we describe as hedonicity, a hedonic quality, whether it's pleasurable or not. That's not a description, right? That's not a true description, in that it eludes representation. We'll come on to this. Something that eludes representation because it's excessive, because it gestures away from itself, as if it's too much for its own form to contain. So this is the first image that appeared of this mushroom in print, but actually it's the first book dedicated to a single mushroom species that was published in 1564. There's 2 copies of it left in the world. One is in a library in The Hague, and it was written by a Dutch doctor called Adrian de Jonge, Adrian the Younger, or Hadrianus Junius was his Latin name. And this mushroom is now called Phallus hadriani. Adrian's phallus, right? Which I'm not sure whether he would have been pleased about. But what drew him was obviously the kind of phallic shape, but also that it grew in sand dunes, which was unusual, because mushrooms, according to naturalists then, would grow in sour, dank places. But in that effort to describe this mushroom, this physician who's going out to try, in that kind of Renaissance effort, to see things for himself, to report back to his patients something that may be beneficial, may be a cure for some symptom, relied on prose, poetry, but also a visual representation. So took this mushroom back in bits, because they degrade very, very quickly. Gave it to a famous Renaissance painter, Dutch painter, in the city of Delft called Marten van Heemskerk, who drew these beautiful great etchings, woodcuts, but these incredible oil paintings. But this image, Charles Baden, who's an English mycologist, famously said, 10 minutes with a stinkhorn is 9 minutes too many. Because its smell truly is disgusting. And if I were to bring one out now, in this space, initially you would think, it's not that bad. But if we allow it to mature, if we give it time, then it moves down from the head to somewhere much closer to the stomach. So what happens in this image is that the artist anatomizes the mushroom, breaks it off into bits. This is a surgical procedure, but one that would have been familiar to the Dutch physician who first described it. And we'll come back to the language that surrounds this mushroom as well, which is very bodily. But in terms of this mushroom being resisting representation, people didn't believe that this mushroom existed, that it could look so rude and provocative, right? And these woodcuts during that period, they would just move around different printers. But sometimes they'd never seen, the printers had never seen them before for themselves. And it didn't say the orientation that the image needed to appear. So this mushroom kept on appearing, sometimes vertically, erect, and sometimes flaccid, right? And as you'll see, and even it tricks me because we decided to print it on the cover of my book like this, but even now I can't remember which way is up and which way is down. So this inversion is cause of something that just keeps on getting turned, twisted and turned, that's fundamentally weird, right? And we'll come back to that as well. I want to be true to that spirit of Junius crawling about in the sand dunes in Holland to describe this mushroom for himself. So I went out and I discovered this mushroom a few years ago. I know some of you are mushroomers here. There is something weird that happens. Usually it's when I take my knife out of my pocket. It's almost like I manifest them. I went to Holland to smell the copy of the book that you saw earlier and to do an odour analysis of it, which is not that exciting, so I'm not going to talk to you about that. But in that moment of traversing these sand dunes, I kind of knew instinctively that I would find this mushroom. And came across it in minutes. When you remove it from the sand, where it grows around dead hares, rabbits, seagulls, badger sets, this mushroom egg quickly turns a violet colour. And that's how you distinguish it between other mushroom species. So the one on the left, which stays white, is the common stinkhorn. The one on the right is the dune stinkhorn. They smell very different. But it's only in an encounter with that you can tell the difference. This one on the left smells... Has anyone smelled a stinkhorn before? Yeah? You smelled these stinkhorns before? You have? Okay.
Not this one.
Not this one. Okay. So the difference between the two of them, and I'm quite familiar, and my children are very familiar with these smells as well, is the one on the left is very strong, very kind of garlicky, very oniony, like rotten turnips, like bin juice. You know, when you're composting, that kind of like residue that drips out. But the one on the right smells strongly of semen, of rotting flesh, an old refrigerator that's been unplugged for some time. So your reaction right now, right? This is what happens in an encounter with it. It's something that is ambivalent in that it moves, it vacillates between something that's delightful and something that's disgusting. But I would argue that more than the sight of the thing, that what attracts you to it is its sound and its smell. So it attracts three main species of fly. Musca domestica, the housefly, Calaphora vomitaria, which means bearer of beauty, right? And Calaphora vacinia. Now when these three flies swarm together, they produce this, not quite a chord, a tritone, which is a D and a D sharp with that third note, an F, just above them, which isn't a kind of, it resists harmony, right? There's something uncomfortable, it's unresolved. And when you're experiencing that, plus that fetid smell, it's overwhelming. It's a reminder of something that's abject, but it's ancient as well. Something that even if we haven't experienced it directly for ourselves, somewhere, whether it's in our brains or in our bodies, kind of knows that we need to be careful when we're moving around it. And the flies will disperse very quickly. But as you stay still, they will always come back to it because they're compelled towards it. They can sense it from up to 3 kilometers away. this mushroom has evolved to synthesize the smell of a rotting corpse. Now, when we talk about a rotting corpse, and again in the literature it says it smells rotten, it smells cadaverous, it smells corpse-like. Even these ideas of what a corpse smells like. Smell is metonymic. It always gestures away from itself. You know, even when Juliet talked about a rose smelling so sweet, called by another name, right? The smell of a rose, we know, any botanist would know, there are roses and there are roses. And the complexity of the rose smell, like the complexity of any smell, is made up of a number of chemical compounds. Do you know this? I spoke about this a bit yesterday, and it's not a word that necessarily translates into American English, but the word corpsing in theatre, you might know as breaking character. So in Saturday Night Live, where people try to resist laughing, right? And when people do it deliberately, it seems indulgent and it puts us off, right? But that putting off is actually the effect of corpsing. It comes from, in English, in British English, from around the 1950s, when on stage an actor pretending to be dead would get a fit of giggles. And the audience, who knows this is artifice, the spell is broken. And they know that that spell is broken as the result of a stifled laugh. Somebody's breath being visible. And that sound is infectious, it's contagious. Corpsing has another kind of quality to it as well, which is to do with the failure of motivation, right? So where we understand collectively that this character needs to behave or needs to perform this role, and when they break that role, and that veil is stripped, something happens to us. There's a history of this in Catholicism and the odour of sanctity, where saintliness, the corpse, doesn't putrefy. So very famously, this French Carmelite nun called Little Flower, Sainte Thérèse, in Lisieux in France, when she died, her corpse was said to smell sweetly of violets and roses. People flocked, not to see this body, but to smell it. And everyone reported that same fragrant smell of incense and balm and roses, that sweet floral fragrance. When her body was exhumed in 1911, again, people flocked to her graveside to witness the coffin being opened, and that sweet smell was said to fill the air. And again, 13 years later, sorry, this was in 1917, the body was exhumed a second time. And again, people reported that odour being present. Now, there are people that have argued against this, that have said that sweet smell that surrounded the body was actually not the product of saintliness, but the results of ketoacidosis, which is when the body starts to digest itself as a result of being starved, right? So, a parent to a child or somebody who knows somebody with type 1 diabetes might know this smell. It smells like pear drops or nail polish remover. It's kind of got a sweet but sometimes cloying smell. My daughter has diabetes, and it's a warning. It's a warning smell. So stink and these kind of pungent odours can also be penetrating in the sense of piercing. I'm going to just quickly run through an experiment that we did in trying to actually articulate in the same way that Martin van Heemskerk did in 1564 with that image. How do you separate a complex smell into individual notes? And already we're into the realm of music. Right? So by going through the literature, finding all of these phrases, you know, how this mushroom has been described historically, and then using those phrases and working with a team of heritage scientists to try and understand what actually does this mushroom, this original mushroom, what does it actually smell like? It smells of mushrooms, right? The main compound in it is 1-octanol 3,1, which is the same smell that you'll get in your button mushrooms in the store, right? But it's in such concentrations that it becomes pungent. So already this idea of amplification, something that's to do with intensity, that again is not to do with the characteristic, but it's to do with amplitude, with intensity, can really push something over from being delightful to disgusting. But one of the main compounds is also cadaverine, which is a brilliant name for a compound that really does its job, right? Cadaverine. And has this sperm-like, sweetish, kind of doughy smell, which when you smell it originally, doesn't smell that bad. Yeah? But if it's in the boot of your car, right, or on your kitchen table when you're photographing it for the cover of your book, is absolutely revolting. And it has this magical effect where, as if from nowhere, it can tease out flies. If we were to have one here, in the course of an hour or two, we would start to hear and see flies. So in this workshop, we encourage people to kind of smell these single compounds. There's 10 of them, become familiar with them. These are people who are already kind of trained in heritage science. They work with fragrance designers. And then eventually present the mushroom. It looks like this. Very sad looking mushroom. Yeah. But still very disgusting. But even saying that, we know that smell is relative too. It's based on context. So when you raise to your lips a piece of a cracker smeared with Epoisse cheese, right? It contains the same compounds as hog shit, but still you put it in your mouth. Right?
I think stinky tofu, that's the standard.
What do you think, sir?
Stinky tofu.
Stinky tofu?
Yes.
I don't know what that is, stinky tofu. That's just rank tofu that's gone off.
No,
It's a delicacy.
It's
Is
a
it really?
delicacy.
Okay, we'll get to that. There are other examples, and this is why it's problematic to say that there are foods that are disgusting or have disgusting odours, because it is relative. And part of this exercise was people saying, actually I find this pleasant. This odour reminded me of cooking in my country, right? Or it could be the hakarl, that delicacy of rotting Greenland shark, can be comforting. Where I'm from, Scotland, the smell of haggis is delicious, right? But I understand that if I was to go into my car and smell a ripe haggis, I'd be very disappointed. We put this mushroom into a container and heated it up to 256 degrees. This machine, which is about this long, right? Looks like a bunch of photocopiers pressed up to each other. And a kind of Heath Robinson style tube with a glass funnel at the end of it. And at every point, different compounds are then released, and you're smelling it in real time. And you see this spike here? It's a Stinkhorn mushroom pot. This spike is a compound being released, but sometimes we can't smell them. Yeah? Sometimes that compound is there, but it's inodorous, or at least to humans. Again, maybe not every human. There's a genetic propensity to smell. Some smells and not others. We describe its intensity, we describe memory. And this is what I found, which was very similar to Cage's experience in Harvard in the anechoic chamber, where, I know some of you will know, that experience of coming out and describing two tones, one pitched high and one pitched slightly lower, and being told by the technician that what he was hearing in this supposedly soundless chamber was his body being reflected back, and it was the sound of his nervous system and the sound of his circulatory system. So this is the body being reflected back. I realized in this moment how powerful I am, right? But we are, as smellers. We don't lack smelling capability the way that we kind of give over to other creatures. We are very, very powerful, but we draw on experiences based on our own phenomenology, but our own encounters. So we would be describing the smells of toasted almonds, the smell of marshmallows, the smell of sweaty socks and Parmesan cheese. We would be describing the smell of a boyfriend's bedroom. Right? We would be describing the smell of sex. And in that, even though we'd be kind of reaching around for language as close as we could, it would always evade us. And that's why this exercise was repeated 3 times. So it's a 3-hour sniffing exercise. And you can see written upon a face where it moves between delight and disgust. Okay. Part of my job at the Botanics is to try to uncover, or at least acknowledge, that smells are part of our heritage. So this olfactory heritage, the smell of this mushroom, being important in the history of mycology, it's also important in the history, or in how we move through the natural landscape. It's important to the landscape that I'm close to, but it's also in the coastal regions of Holland and elsewhere. And what we're trying to do is not only synthesize this scent using the smell data, but also using the data from our own encounters in the field. I'm going to show you this dead quick. Did I bring it with me? This is what we're basing on, which is it's beautiful. It looks like a paint chart, right? It was published in 1969 by one of the former Regius keepers for the Botanics, which is different colours. It's trying to find a standardised way of describing fungal flesh. So we're recreating this scratch and sniff card, which we separate the different compounds, but people can then understand how these smells are all combined. The challenge as an artist and a writer is, how do you write stink? I might talk to you a little bit about how you speak stink. We know this already, how we speak shit, how you talk shit. Right? There's even a history there about how we kind of mangle language, how the tongue gets tied, and how in the act of vocalizing we can produce something that's stinky. A language that's not so fragrant. I'm going to just quickly run through some of the language around the Stinkhorn, around the phallus. Again, this momentary phallus. This phallus only really exists for a couple of hours, right? In this state. It grows from a vulva. Vulva is a very old word that's used by Pliny, which just means wrapper, right? So it grows from this egg. So colloquially it's also called a witch's egg or a devil's egg. So even in the 16th century they described this other way of articulating this mushroom in relation to kind of folklore. You can kind of see sliced in half there. So this is the nascent mushroom waiting to erupt. And it's this stuff here, this mucilage, that people describe as being so cool to the touch that it was almost like as cold as ice. But of course it's under the ground. So it's absorbing all of that. The heat is being taken away from it. And it's this spore mass here, which is called the gleba. This is how it disperses its spores. It's beautiful. And all of this force that it has can penetrate asphalt. It can grow up through pavements. And yet you can crumble it in your fingers. It's got the same kind of texture as prawn crackers. And at its tip, this bell end, this glans. Again, back to the anatomy of the penis, but a glans just means acorn. And it's this slime that sends flies, flesh flies, and carrion beetles crazy. And it's in a matter of hours that this is stripped. My idea is, how can we use this mushroom as a listening device? Cage reported that his interest in mushrooms and music were that they were next to each other in the dictionary. That's not true anymore. There are other words that have found their way in between. But there is something about making your way through the forest or the sand dunes, whereby music and smell fills the air. And this is the medium of the air. This is what connects mushrooms and music. Some of the conditions that I argue in the book for a stink music, a sonorous scent, is one that, like the ringing of a bell, stink music is prolonged so as to be pervasive. Pervasive just means it passes through. In the same way that our senses are essentially a bunch of holes, right? Your eye holes, your ear holes, and your nose holes, your skin holes for your pores. Something that's prolonged so as to be pervasive, but also something that's ambivalent. That over time, that has a durational aspect to it, that does decay, but isn't necessarily, or it isn't out and out bad. Okay? Isn't disgusting. But like our experience of eating stinky tofu, or epoisse cheese, or even, even kind of in moments of intercourse, or even birth, these smells can be delightful. We know this in kind of music. Eliane Radigue, that plays with tone, things that don't necessarily resolve. What can a kind of stink music afford musicians, composers, both in the making of music, but also in how we listen to music, a type of listening? I'm going to end with a few images, just talking about the efforts of writing this book, but actually in text, how can you inscribe stink? Whether it's instructional or whether it's in smears on a page. And Stinkhorn slime, the spores that are contained on its cap, it's one of the largest mushrooms of the macro fungi. And the mycelium, that kind of underground network, is actually really quite large because it needs to draw huge amounts of water to make that really kind of bulbous subterranean egg. The spores are so tiny because they need to pass through the digestive tracts of these insects that help disperse the spores. it has a laxative effect on them, causing them to shit freely around the site of their meal. And they will favour a stinkhorn mushroom over the rotting corpse next to it. And a single speck of stinkhorn slime can contain up to 20 million spores. So working with this designer said, it would be great if you could use some of the slime for the letter forms. So in my studio I collected enough of the caps in my freezer. And one day when I was feeling brave, decided to use my index finger to draw out these letters. So when you're holding a cover of this book, which you're all going to buy, thank you very much, it's containing billions and billions of potential stinkhorns, or at least the cover originally did. There is a history of how we convey stink in print. In comic books, even kind of as early as the 1890s, when people were talking about the atomizer, right? Which was a tool that even Lacan talks about. And Freud in looking down the throat of Irma and sees in her terminal bones, which are again relate to the nose, right? The spray that he used to administer cocaine, right, was this atomizer, psst, or psst, which again is a sound word and a smell word, right? It pierces. In German classrooms, they use this word psst instead of shh. Okay, but it's also something that cuts through, penetrates. It's like a whisper. These images, these wavy lines, are called wafterton. You know this episode of Ren and Stimpy? It's brilliant. It's really good. It's called Stimpy's First Fart. And he farts, and he becomes so attached to his fart, right, that when Ren banishes it, Stimpy becomes depressed. Eventually, the fart, Stinky, returns home and is reunited with his dad, Stimpy, and marries Cora, a rotting fish, before they fly up Ren's nose. But where this kind of verticality gets put on its side is when it's a sweet smell. So again, in early kind of cartoons, we see this image of this scent off-screen scent that causes animals who've been civilized in our literature, in our cinema, to stand on their hind legs and to adopt, apart from Donald Duck, clothing. But again, this sweet smell, this fragrant smell, turns them back into lower beasts, creatures, animals, again, where they return to our kind of horizontal form. The first words spoken, synced in animation, do you know what they were? In 1923, I think it was, the Carnival Kid, Mickey Mouse, shouts, "Hot dog!" When you look on Wikipedia, it says that he says hot dogs. Hot dog! Hot dog! That sibilant S is cut off, partly to do with the technology, because the microphones were so sensitive that they would break, they would rupture, they would be distorted. Hot dog! The first voice of Mickey Mouse was not in that high-pitched falsetto that we know now. Hot dog! It was lower pitched because Walt Disney himself, who was a professional smoker. Hot dog! Even the hot dogs who are rendered mute, although they dance, yeah, are themselves given these stink lines. I just wanted to include that today because it's good fun. Yeah? I did have a whole section about the buccal voice of Donald Duck, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to return to the Stinkhorn in one final weird term. And I use that word deliberately, weird, which etymologically just means to twist or turn. But in my case, is literally that, because in the middle of this project, thinking about this mushroom so deeply for the last 5 years, a couple of years into the project, on a train going down to see a fashion designer who was making for me a Stinkhorn inspired costume, I experienced a very extreme and unpleasant odour that shortly afterwards caused me to collapse on the train carriage floor. I was listening to a piece of music at the time. I can remember feeling really euphoric and then utterly desperate before everything went blank. I had these funny turns repeatedly for the next year, every month, like menstruation. And the day that the World Health Organization announced that a lack of smell or taste was associated with COVID infection, I was diagnosed with focal aware temporal epilepsy. So it affects one side of my brain. And it's marked by these sensory seizures, these sensory hallucinations, which was terrifying, right? But I found a good company in a lot of artists throughout history, including Dostoevsky. And if you've ever read The Idiot, has some of the best descriptions of an epileptic seizure and that feeling of euphoria followed by the abyss, plus all of the sensory hallucinations that accompany. And it emanates from this part of the brain, which looks like a talon, called the uncus. The sound has changed. Anyway, I just want to do this for a second. It shows that I've got very thin lips, I think, as well. And the experience of going through the MRI scanner, and we talked about this yesterday, and I found some other people who agreed with me. It was a wonderful experience, as terrifying as the prospect of what we would find out. Being screwed, my head being screwed into this machine, and then that kind of four-dimensional music being played through your body, penetrating through your body, I thought was astonishing. Accompanying these, as an artist, and this is what we do, right? We move towards that which frightens us to try and find either good company with other artists, or to try and find something that may relate our experience to others. So when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor says, be careful not to instrumentalize your disease for your art, which is a good line, right? But at the same time I disagree with it. Yeah? But we do need to be careful. But in the moment that I was before these seizures, as well as that kind of horrible, fetid, cool, chemical smell, which is historically associated with the smell of burning, which is actually the smell of acrylamide, a type of chemical which we experience in burning toast and burning fossil fuels. Yeah? Because it's something, even in our ancient smell memory, is because it's symptomatic of a dysfunctional brain. We move away from it. And in some of the literature where epileptics have described their seizure, they talk about a voice that appears on one side that they're fearful of turning towards, even though they're hallucinating, for the fear that they will fall down. And in my seizures, I experienced the same four faces speaking simultaneously. And I was saying this yesterday, that I only really knew who two of these people were. They're all actors, but I found in them one common thing, I think, in that when they smile, part of their lip droops down to the left, ever so slightly. And there's something kind of awkward. You know that word gauche, which just means to the left, right? It's just the scrapings of your subconscious. But these mouths all spoke at once. It was a incessant humming, a rushing, or a buzzing, or a ringing, the noises that Gershwin described experiencing, simultaneously with the smell of burning toast when he was on stage at Carnegie Hall. I think this looks a bit like Justin Bieber, but maybe that's just me. Anyway. In Beckett's Not I, this disembodied mouth talks about a buzzing, and a brain begging. This buzzing and humming are words that keep on reoccurring in association with epilepsy and these focal aware seizures, these hallucinations that are combined with another symptom, which is the brain informing other parts of the body that something has gone wrong. Stink is a warning, but it's also a potential cure. And what I found, which was remarkable in engaging with this project, which is a connection between mushrooms, music, and meloders, is also one that is autobiographical, but relates to other people's experiences throughout history, where people have been trying to find clues in nature for either a cure for themselves or something to be connected to. And I found, stretching back as early as 1601, this phrase that stinkhorns were a potential cure for gout, rheumatism, and epilepsy. And this struck me as being quite remarkable. Even in actually Cage's, the Trust yesterday, and David Aurora, in one of the books in John Cage's library, repeats this line as well about stinkhorns being a potential cure for epilepsy. What does that mean, a cure for epilepsy? Stinkhorns as a cure for epilepsy. The only thing I could think of, and I went back quite far, is that according to the doctrine of signatures, people believed that a benevolent God would have peppered the world with clues of plants and fungi and other things that we may be able to use to treat ourselves. And we may be able to find them because they look like parts of our bodies, or they bear some relation to the thing that we're trying to cure. So the fact that a stinkhorn cap looks like a brain, but also emerges from what looks like an infant's skull, or an animal skull, a mammal skull. And there are examples of skull lichen that was cultivated, lichen which is, a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungi. Skull lichen. Lichen just means that which eats and licks around itself. And skull lichen, or skull moss as it's sometimes described, was cultivated often on the skulls of criminals because they believed that it was much more potent, a much more potent cure. And I found in a neurologist that was writing in the 1950s about introducing foul smells at the point of an epileptic seizure. And that they found that at that moment where that rising, that aura, which just means that Galen talks about an aura, which is just a breeze, a cool breeze rising up, that this smell could halt a seizure. And it didn't have to be a quote-unquote pleasant smell. It just needed to be an intense smell. That's pretty much it. But the idea of how a stinkhorn can be used to inform a kind of listening practice, an art practice, is one that still excites me. I keep on saying that I'm done with mushrooms, right? But I'm obviously not. I'm just understanding more where I fit within its ecology. Maybe we will speak about this very, very briefly, right? Thank you very much for this image. Do you know this plant, the corpse flower? Coming back to corpsing again. Just nearly 150 years ago, an Italian botanist called Odoardo Beccari, whose first name is an almost anagram of adore a bad odour, right? He discovered, in inverted quotes, this corpse flower in western Sumatra, brought it back to India and sent it back to somebody in Italy, where they tried to cultivate it. Cultivated it first in India and then in Kew Gardens. And when it flowered for the first time in, I think, 1912, the Times newspaper reported riots when people flocked, not just to see this blooming titan, also named after a phallus, Amorphophallus. It was the first time that people flocked to a smell as spectacle. 150 years on, you're much more likely, well, you are more likely to experience this flower in botanic gardens than you are in the wild, than its natural habitat. We have become its pollinators. Humans have become its pollinators. We are saprophiles. We are lovers of decay, even though we distance ourselves from it. 510 corpse flowers have bloomed in 150 years in captivity. Yeah? They've got some very good names as well. The Amazing Stinko is my favourite. This was a costume that is getting its first outing next week at Harvard on stage, with me in it. But it's not supposed to look like, this is also the job of an artist. It's also to kind of look at things, as Virginia Woolf would say, slant. So how this mushroom can inform a practice. And it already has, so in terms of instructional scores, that mythical, magical, musical instrument, the Stinkhorn, an instrument that is certainly a brass instrument, can be used to make music. So, who was I describing this to? Maybe it was yesterday at the dinner. I can't remember. But that 1 octanol 3-1. I'm going to end here. That scent, part of this score, was an instruction to a tuba player to take the mouthpiece, which already looks like a mushroom, to place a paper test strip over the mouthpiece of the brass instrument. And the instruction is to play the scent. And that scent quickly dissipates. So that being tuned into the smell of a mushroom, which also is the smell of brass, which is also the smell of when the blood hits the air when you get a scratch. It's very rich. Thank you very much.